Good day. Today is Monday, 12th May 2025, and as I make this program, we are on the countdown towards further announcements from the EU of further sanctions against Russia. One is tempted to say that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Donald Trump was inaugurated back on the 20th of January. He spoke about a diplomatic initiative to end the war. Many people had grave doubts that that would happen. He did come up with various ideas and suggestions, not so much about how to end the war, the conflict in Ukraine itself, but apparently to try to improve relations with Russia. The initiative, the momentum gradually faded away. By the end of March, it had become obvious, at least to me, that no real progress of any kind was being made at all. And anyway, we are where we are. Now, let's just retrace our steps over what has been happening over the last 24 hours. At the end of my last program, I discussed President Putin's response to the ultimatum delivered by the four European leaders plus Zelensky in Kiev yesterday, demanding that on Saturday, demanding that Russia agree to a unconditional 30-day ceasefire by the end of today, failing which further sanctions would be imposed. We were given to understand by the European leaders that they discussed this whole thing with Donald Trump and that the United States is on board with this proposal and would support the sanctions itself and would indeed move forward and impose further sanctions. Anyway, the European leaders, using incredibly aggressive and belligerent language, and indeed insulting language about President Putin, language which would work against any serious move to begin negotiations or to agree a ceasefire. Anyway, they announced their ultimatum on Saturday, and after a few hours, late in the evening, or to be more precise, early on Sunday morning, President Putin gave his response. He rejected the ultimatum. He explained that a ceasefire, given previous Ukrainian failures to abide by ceasefires, was an unworkable idea. He'd already explained in the past why ceasefires, 30-day ceasefires or longer ceasefires, if they were not monitored properly, if military assistance to Ukraine was not ended, if intelligence assistance to Ukraine was not ended, would merely result in Ukraine strengthening its military position. And Putin said that in light of that, he was not prepared to accept the ultimatum or agree to a ceasefire. Instead, he made his own proposal, which was essentially, by the way, a repeat of a proposal he has been making for a long time, years in fact, for direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to resume. They were broken off, as he said, by Ukraine in April 2022 after the Istanbul agreement was mostly agreed and initialed. Anyway, he proposed that those agreements resumed. He said that he would send a delegation with a chief negotiator to Istanbul on Thursday the 15th of May, and he was hoping or expecting that the Ukrainians would do the same. Now, there's a number of points I want to make here which cover points that various people have made. For example, a number of people have said that it's not realistic to imagine that Ukraine would be able to benefit significantly from a 30-day ceasefire. Well, I'm not sure actually that is in fact the case. Certainly soldiers can be rested and rotated after 30 days. Trenches can be rebuilt, fortifications can be repaired, counterattacks can be organised and staged. But the key thing to understand is that even General Kellogg, or perhaps more precisely General Kellogg, the sole begetter of the idea of the 30-day ceasefire, has said that in practice, if there is a 30-day ceasefire, it will become open-ended. The Russians would certainly be expected to abide by it, to continue to abide by it beyond those 30 days. And the expectation was that it would become a permanent ceasefire and lead to a freeze of the conflict, which, of course, the Russians have repeatedly said they're not prepared to agree to. But the real objection to the ceasefire, I suspect, from a Russian point of view, is that unless all these various provisions that Putin has been talking about, the various nuances were brought into effect, the ending of military supplies, intelligence assistance to the Ukrainians, the proper monitoring of the ceasefire by impartial third parties. The ceasefire that was proposed on Saturday would have been monitored by the United States, which people consistently forget is a party to the conflict, something that is inconsistent with the pretense that the United States is a mediator in this conflict. The New York Times has told us how deeply involved during the Biden administration the United States actually was in managing the war in Ukraine, let alone simply supplying weapons and economic and military assistance to Ukraine. Anyway, the point is that if such a ceasefire were ever to be brought into effect, as night followed day, allegations would circulate very quickly that it had been violated. The fingers would be pointing at the Russians. They would be accused of violating the agreement. That would then lead to economic and military pressure against Russia being stepped up, and it would put the Russians on the back foot in media and public relations terms, something which for obvious reasons they don't want to find themselves in. And of course, if Western troops, French and British troops, were to enter Ukraine, which would be difficult to achieve over the period of a 30-day ceasefire, but I suspect not completely impossible, especially given the reports that there are already French troops stationed in Romania, well then it would be, from a Russian point of view, even more important to refuse such a ceasefire in the first place. Anyway, that is the first thing to say about the Russian refusal. Whatever people may feel about this idea of a 30-day ceasefire, whether they think it is a good idea or a bad idea, ultimately, and this again needs to be reiterated, it is the Russians who will decide whether they are going to accept it or not. From their point of view, it is understandable why they would not accept it. And given that they are intent on rejecting it, it makes little point to go on repeatedly demanding it. Anyway, that's the first thing I was going to say. The second point, and it's a point I've made many times, is that the Russian argument that there is no reason why you have to have a ceasefire before starting negotiations. In most conflict situations, negotiations begin as the parties move closer to each other. A consensus develops to agree a ceasefire, and a ceasefire is at that point agreed. Declaring a ceasefire before nothing has been agreed at all, when the gulf between the two sides is as enormous as it currently is is simply a recipe for trouble. It is a recipe for failure, or at best, the freezing of the conflict, which is something that the Russians have repeatedly said they will not agree to, and which is not in their interest, especially given that they're winning the war. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. It was that Russian position was predictable and it was understandable. Anyway, after President Putin said this, and after he proposed that there be a meeting between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul on Thursday in order to resume negotiations between the two parties, well, we had a succession of posts, messages on Truth Social by Donald Trump. Now, bear in mind that according to the official narrative, Donald Trump supported the ultimatum that the Western powers, the European powers, announced on Saturday, and had agreed to impose the sanctions on Russia if the Europeans went ahead and did so, because the Russians did not agree to the ceasefire. But I have pointed out that his original message on Truth Social, in which he spoke about supporting sanctions against Russia, was written in vague and ambiguous terms and seemed heavily qualified. He spoke of the United States imposing sanctions on whichever party violated the ceasefire, presumably after its terms were agreed, which of course never happened. He spoke in neutral language about Russia and Ukraine, careful neither to criticize neither. And he spoke in ways that suggested that he didn't really believe that a ceasefire would be agreed. He used words like ideally and hopefully, which all suggested to me that he had little real belief in the ceasefire coming into effect, that he was reconciled to the inevitability of imposing further sanctions on the Russians if they didn't comply with the ultimatum, but that his heart wasn't really in it. And in my program yesterday, I said that I thought that the best thing that President Trump could do after Putin's proposal for a meeting between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul on Thursday was to forget all about that, forget about ceasefires and ultimatums and further sanctions, but instead tell Zelensky that the game is now up. He must send his people to Istanbul on Thursday. Negotiations should begin without any further delay, because that is the only realistic way forward if there is going to be ultimately any end to the war. And when I said that in my program yesterday, I said that I did not seriously expect that President Trump would act in that way. It seemed to me that he was, by this point, deeply committed to the ultimatum plan, and that I expected that the Europeans and the Americans gave every sign of being taken by surprise and nonplussed. I expected that they would go ahead with their sanctions announcement later today, and I didn't expect that Donald Trump would act in the way that I thought best for him, by urging the Ukrainians to turn up and to begin the negotiations on Thursday. Well, here I will admit I was taken by surprise, because immediately, shortly after Putin spoke, President Trump published his first message on Truth Social, And it seemed, unlike his previous message, the message in which he spoke about perhaps the United States imposing sanctions together with the Europeans if the ceasefire was not honoured, which seemed to be tepid, certainly by his standards. This other subsequent message on Truth Social, by contrast, seemed almost euphoric. He spoke about, he gave the impression that he thought that some great breakthrough had been achieved, that he was full of hope that the conflict would end. He spoke about how the bloodbath in Ukraine might soon come to an end, and what a wonderful thing that would be. It appeared that he saw Saturday as a great day and that he was looking forward to big events over the course of this week, big events obviously being the beginning of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And then a few hours passed and he made his wish for negotiations to begin. Even if no ceasefire was in place, he made his wish explicit. He published another message on Truth Social, and he said this: President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. The word bloodbath is capitalized. Ukraine should agree to this immediately, and the word immediately is also capitalized. At least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible, and if it is not, European leaders and the United States will know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. I am starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin, who's too busy celebrating the victory of World War II, which could not have been won, not even close, without the United States of America. Have the meeting now. The words "have the meeting now," again, capitalized. So, late in the afternoon on Saturday in the United States, that message appeared, and apparently it caused consternation across Europe. And not just across Europe, but I suspect among some people within his own administration. Because shortly before this message appeared, Donald Trump's own peace envoy, Keith Kellogg, published his own message, I believe on X, in which he said that the first needed to be a ceasefire and only then negotiations. This has been General Kellogg's consistent stance ever since he wrote his article back in April 2024. He is overwhelmingly focused on freezing the conflict. He sees the ceasefire as the mechanism to do that. He's not really, I suspect, interested in the kind of negotiation that Putin believes in, one which would be intended to address what Putin calls the root causes of the conflict. As General Kellogg made clear in his April 2024 article, he doesn't even fully exclude the possibility that Ukraine might eventually enter NATO, maybe in 10 or 20 years' time. And as I've pointed out in previous programs, a US media report, I believe in the New York Times, saying that US officials had told the Ukrainians at the recent meetings in Paris and London, where the Americans set out their proposals, that though Trump would never agree to Ukraine joining NATO, a future American administration might have a different stance on this issue. The only official at that time in London, who could have said that was Kellogg himself. And I have no doubt that it was indeed Kellogg who told the Ukrainians this. So Kellogg, working on his plan, trying to obtain a freeze on the conflict, looking eventually to give the Ukrainians pretty much all they want, eventually their territory, plus NATO membership, but not immediately, not in a year's time or 2 years' time, perhaps in 5, 10 or 15 or 20 years' time. Anyway, Kellogg supported Zelensky's position and said that first there has to be a ceasefire and then there have to be talks, which is the diametric opposite of what the president who has appointed him, Donald Trump, says in this message on Truth Social, which I have just read out. President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. Have the meeting now. So that's Donald Trump's stance. And of course, it wasn't just Donald Trump's stance or General Kellogg's stance. It was the united stance of all of the European leaders. Macron, for example, said that, Putin had made one small step in the right direction, but clearly a ceasefire was needed. And all of the other European leaders basically went on saying the same thing. And Zelensky himself, up to that moment, had been saying the same thing. He too appeared to reject the proposal for the talks in Istanbul on Thursday, the 15th of May, until, of course, this message from Trump appeared on Truth Social. And I have read, I think it was somewhere in the British media, an article that says that the Europeans were not only stunned, but actually livid by this message of Donald Trump's. They felt that the ground was being cut from under their feet, that their attempt to intimidate and scare the Russians had been negated, that they'd imagined, this is from the article itself, that they'd got Putin into a corner. I don't understand how, by the way, that they imagined that they'd got Putin into a corner, and then along comes Trump and undermines everything by publishing this Truth Social post. Anyway, it seems that the Europeans were livid about this Truth Social message. And shortly after, the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy telephoned Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, clearly wanting reassurance that the American policy had not changed. And in fact, that was precisely the reassurance that Marco Rubio gave to David Lammy. Secretary of State, this is from the State Department's website, Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke today with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy. The Secretary reaffirmed the US position on the Russia-Ukraine war. Our top priority remains bringing an end to the fighting and an immediate ceasefire. Not, notice, getting talks started between Russia and Ukraine. So we can see that after the Truth Social post from Donald Trump, which appeared to urge the negotiations, Marco Rubio was in effect contradicting his boss and telling the Europeans, basically, don't worry, it's just Trump, sounding off again on Truth Social. We're all with you, we're fully behind you, the sanctions will come, just go ahead, implement the ultimatum, and we will support you. Well, understandably, perhaps the Europeans couldn't just leave it at that, and neither could Zelensky himself. And of course, he clearly doesn't want negotiations with the Russians. And he reaffirmed after the Truth Social post by Donald Trump appeared that he still expected, in fact insisted, on a ceasefire before the start of negotiations. But then he said something which was clearly intended to attract attention and to in some way counter the effect of Putin's offer by declaring grandly that he would go to Istanbul himself and was expecting to meet no less a person than Vladimir Putin there. Now, Axios, the US magazine, says that Zelensky has made it clear that he intends to go to Istanbul and be there on the 15th of May, whether Putin turns up or not, and whether there is a ceasefire or not. I have to say, I have not myself been able to find any evidence that this is indeed what Zelensky is saying about his declaring his readiness to go to Istanbul. Well, that, of course, is a public fact. But the only statements of Zelensky which I have been able to find appear to reaffirm his insistence that before any kind of negotiations or diplomatic contacts begin, the Russians must first agree to the ceasefire. So, if that is correct, then frankly, whether he's offering to go himself or not is irrelevant, because on the assumption that the Russians stick to their position, as I fully expect, and do not declare a ceasefire, as I also fully expect, then neither he, Zelensky, nor any other Ukrainian official is going to go to Istanbul at all. And I should say that other Ukrainian officials, members of Zelensky's team, people like Yermak and Podolyak, in effect seem to be saying the same thing. So I don't myself expect Zelensky to go to Istanbul on Thursday, because I don't expect there to be a ceasefire in place before Thursday. And for the record, the Russian news agency Novosti contacted the Turkish authorities, and they said that they had no information about any planned trip by Zelensky to Istanbul at all. For the record, I think that Zelensky's offer, if that is what it is one that no one should take seriously. It is, again, an example of how for Zelensky, and indeed for his entire government, public relations is the single most important aspect of their conduct of the conflict. Let's assume that Zelensky goes to Istanbul on Thursday and Putin doesn't turn up. What exactly is he going to do? Is he going to meet with the Russian representatives, including the chief negotiator, that Putin and his aide, Yuri Ushakov, have said they will appoint and send to Istanbul? Well, presumably not. He will doubtless say that meeting with these underlings is beneath him. He is the president of Ukraine, and he only meets with the really important people, or to be more precise, the only important person, who is Putin himself. Let us say that Zelensky takes a different stance and does meet with the Russian negotiators. What exactly is he going to say to them that's going to be in any way different from what a properly briefed and prepared team of negotiators appointed by Ukraine would say? What is his need to be in Istanbul separate from that of a properly organised team of negotiators? And if, which I don't seriously expect, Putin himself does turn up in Istanbul. What is Zelensky going to agree with Putin over the course of just a few minutes or perhaps an hour or so of meetings? Are they going to resolve the entire conflict over the course of one conversation? Are they going to agree to conduct the entire negotiation by themselves? Zelensky has in the past said that though every other Ukrainian official is precluded from talking to the Russians as a result of his October 2022 decree, he himself is in some way exempt from the effect of this decree, and so he can conduct the negotiations with Russia all by himself. Does he really think the Russians would take that proposal seriously? Does he really think that Putin would take it seriously? The whole proposal is absurd. It is ridiculous. It is simply, again, as I said, an attempt to steal the limelight, to somehow draw attention away from Putin's proposal for negotiations, and to make it seem as if Zelensky is doing something big and important, when what he's actually proposing, that he himself go to Istanbul, is confirmation of his own complete lack of seriousness in his approach to this matter. Anyway, that is what Zelensky said. Maybe he will go to Istanbul. Probably he won't. I don't seriously believe Putin will go. A negotiating team from Russia will no doubt arrive in Istanbul. Putin said when he gave his statement on Saturday, late on Saturday, or early in the morning on Sunday, that he would speak to Erdogan on the following day to see whether Erdogan and the Turks would be prepared to provide facilities for the negotiation. Putin was as good as his word. He did speak to Erdogan on Sunday. Erdogan, exactly as I anticipated, told him that, of course, Turkey will do everything to make the arrangements for a meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians possible. They will make all the facilities, all the conference facilities and all of that available. But in reality, as I said, the fact is that it's not going to happen. There won't be a Ukrainian team going to Istanbul. The Russians might go there, but if they do, they will find that they have no one to speak to. This whole strange exercise, this move and countermove that we have seen over the last couple of days play out, as I said, has been a exercise, not even in shadow boxing. It's been an exercise in presentational battles. To repeat again, Putin has not budged from his position that there have to be negotiations leading to a ceasefire, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians and ultimately the Americans also will come to what the Americans are going to do shortly. The Americans also have not shifted from their position that there cannot be negotiations without a ceasefire. There is a fundamental difference. It is not merely a difference in procedure. If negotiations take place without a ceasefire, then the pressure will be on the Ukrainians, and we could start to see the negotiations lead towards a fundamental settlement, a peace settlement on Russian terms. If there is a ceasefire before negotiations have started, more likely than not, or at least the best that we are likely to see, is a freeze of the conflict. More likely we will see pressure grow on the Russians to make substantive concessions to Ukraine, negating whatever advantages that they have gained in the war. Plausibly, we could see the ceasefire breakdown in circumstances where the Ukrainians would call on the Europeans and ultimately the United States to become involved, and ultimately the advantage would go to the Ukrainians. So this is not a simple procedural question, as some people may be tempted to say. It is a fundamental difference in approach to the way in which the negotiations are conducted, and it highlights the immense gulf which exists between the two sides. Anyway, there we are. We found ourselves in this strange situation at the moment. Now, Trump wants the Ukrainians, or has said that he wants the Ukrainians to go to Istanbul to initiate discussions with the Russians. Zelensky clearly doesn't want to send a negotiating team, but he's offered to go himself. But he seems to be saying, at least as far as I can judge, he is still saying that if he goes, it will only be after a ceasefire has been agreed. It looks likely that there will not be any Ukrainian presence in Istanbul, because it is all but inconceivable that between now and then we will have a ceasefire. So the Russians will turn up and they will be in an empty room because the Ukrainians won't be there, and they will go back to Moscow and the war will continue. Before then, based on statements they have been making over the last few hours, the Europeans will announce sanctions. And the initiative for this, well, I'm sure all of the European countries are involved, but the Germans have been speaking about it most. A short time ago, the German government spokesman said that there were only 12 hours left before the time limit set by the ultimatum on Saturday expired. The clock was ticking. If the clock runs out, the European Union will move towards further sanctions. Now, I suspect those sanctions won't be put in place immediately. There will have to be a process of consultation. They will no doubt have to be voted on in the European Council. Orban and Fico have the power, in theory, to veto those sanctions. They have consistently refused to do so up to now, whenever we've reached that point of decision. Even if they do veto the sanctions, I expect that ways will be found to circumvent that, and the Europeans will nonetheless, in their own way, separately, manage to impose their sanctions against Russia. The only question, therefore, is what will the United States do? Will Trump wait to see what happens on the 15th of May? Will he wait to see if the Ukrainians do actually go to Istanbul? His latest post on Truth Social rather implies it. If they don't go, will he follow through on what he says? That it proves that Ukraine isn't really interested in a peace agreement with Russia. I'm starting to doubt that Ukraine will make a deal with Putin. And will his anger then be directed at Ukraine and at those who have been telling him to support Ukraine, the Europeans and his own peace envoy, General Kellogg? Or will he instead allow this Truth Social post that he's published to vanish into the ether, and once the sanctions from Europe are imposed, will he come out and announced that the United States supports them by imposing analogous sanctions of their own. I am going to here express my confident guess that he will do the second. He has put himself in a position where it is going to be very difficult now to reverse course. At some point over the last few weeks, he made the critical decision to go with Kellogg and Rubio against Witkoff and Vance. He decided to support their approach to ending or freezing the conflict in Ukraine. He will impose the sanctions that they tell him he should impose. They will no doubt tell him that if he does impose those sanctions, it will put unbearable pressure on the Russians and force the Russians to come round. And I suspect that inwardly he is deeply sceptical. His lack of enthusiasm, as I said in his penultimate Truth Social post, the one in which he spoke about sanctions, speaks for itself. But having already made commitments to this effect, probably to the Ukrainians and certainly to the Europeans, I don't really see how he can go back on them. Now, there is going to be a huge debate and discussion going forward about what Donald Trump's ultimate intentions always were. Whether he was really interested in a peace with Ukraine, whether there was a serious attempt to negotiate with the Russians at all, whether this was, on the contrary, merely an exercise in pulling the wool over the Russians' eyes and getting them to agree to a freeze of the conflict. My own personal view is that Trump never really worked it out. He never really got on top of the detail in the way that his vice president, J.D. Vance, has done. I think he assumed that if he went with Vance, the Russians would indeed back down, probably what Kellogg has been telling him. I think he's dismayed that that isn't happening. I don't think he wants to go down the sanctions road, but he is far too committed to that road now to back away. And as I said in previous programs, if he starts going down the route of sanctions, inevitably, with every further step and escalation of the conflict, he will be pressed by the same assembly of people that he has gone along with up to now: Starmer, Macron, Merz, before then Scholz, Kellogg, Rubio, and the others, not just to escalate sanctions against Russia even further, but to step up military support for Ukraine, so that at some point over the course of the next few weeks or months, he will become Joe Biden too, pursuing the identical policies towards Russia and Ukraine, towards the Ukrainian conflict as a whole, that were pursued by Joe Biden 1, without having, however, the same conviction in those policies that Joe Biden 1 had. Well, that is what I expect will happen. What Trump's ultimate intentions were, what he privately thought, what he discussed with his officials, whether these arguments that we've seen between Witkoff and Vance on the one hand, and Rubio and Kellogg on the other, whether they were real or not. I think one thing I really must say now is it, in the end, doesn't actually even matter. Because once the course has been taken, once the United States commits itself to the policy that it looks as if it's now going to follow, That is what will determine what comes next, not whatever hesitations or doubts or arguments existed previously. Anyway, there we go. That's I think where events are now taking us. It's been, as I said, an extraordinary couple of days. Now, there's been a huge amount of time dedicated to trying to analyse what the Europeans and the Americans have been doing. As for the Europeans, I may as well here express my own opinion. I don't think they have ever expected Putin to agree to the ceasefire. I think they know perfectly well that the unconditional ceasefire proposal is one that the Russians would never agree to. I don't think they want direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. I think that they are extremely nervous of any outcome of those negotiations because they know that with the Russians pressing their advantage, the result of negotiations conducted in the current conditions would eventually be a Ukrainian capitulation to the Russians. I think the entire object of the exercise has been to block the peace initiative that the Europeans were worried Donald Trump was conducting with the Russians in earnest. I think that they seized on this idea of a ceasefire, the one that was proposed by Kellogg, precisely because they knew that it would be unacceptable to the Russians, and precisely because they hoped that by doing so, the entire negotiation process would be wrecked and that Trump would be back at square one, becoming Joe Biden 2 all over again. That is what I think the Europeans were up to. And it was a fairly transparent trap, as far as I can see. You can't expect people like Starmer, Macron, and the others to come up with anything more sophisticated. And it worked. And the reason, obviously, ultimately, why they do not want a negotiated settlement of the conflict in Ukraine is not just because it would mean that Ukraine would make major concessions to Russia, but because the Europeans ultimately do not want to see their worst nightmare come true, which is a serious improvement in relations between the United States and Russia, and ultimately a rapprochement between the United States and Russia. I always assumed that if there were negotiations between the Americans and the Russians to try to end the conflict in Ukraine, the Europeans would do everything within their power to derail them. And it looks as if they're about to succeed. I always thought that if there were serious negotiations initiated by the Americans to end the conflict in Ukraine, the Europeans would do everything within their power to derail those negotiations. For that reason, to prevent an American-Russian rapprochement, which would marginalize Europe in global politics. And it was precisely for that reason, precisely because of those concerns, that Alex Christoforou and I said way back in the summer of 2024 that if Donald Trump was wise, he would stay out of the whole business of trying to negotiate peace in Ukraine entirely. He would know that, diplomatically speaking, it is a bridge too far. He would simply say it was not his war, it was Joe Biden's war. The United States had done all that it can to support Ukraine. It could do no more and would walk away. That would have been a clear-cut, simple and strong position to have taken, and the time to have taken it was in January, directly after President Trump's inauguration. Well, he didn't do that, and exactly as Alex and I predicted, and you can hunt down those programs back in the summer of 2024 when we discussed all of this, exactly as we predicted, that is to say Trump, is now being drawn back in. More and more articles are now appearing saying that this has become Donald Trump's war. When Kiev falls, and it's much more likely now that that is how the war is going to evolve, with Kiev falling, the blame will be placed on him. His MAGA movement are already disaffected and unhappy, and they're likely to become more disaffected and more unhappy still. And when Kiev does fall, he will be left with all the fingers pointing at him, and he being blamed for the outcome, and his own support base in the United States demoralized and less willing to support him than they once were. That was what we predicted would happen, and lo and behold, it is all coming true. Anyway, let us not devote further time to this. Now, let's look at the other side, the Russians. I cannot imagine that Putin himself seriously expects that the Ukrainians are going to send their own negotiating team to Istanbul on Thursday. It looked for a time to me as if this proposal from Putin to send a negotiating team to Istanbul and to wait for the Ukrainians to turn up, it looked to me as if this was a rapid response to the European ultimatum made on Saturday. It actually turns out that it was a lot more complicated than that, because we're now getting all sorts of information, especially from the Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, that in fact, throughout the discussions in Moscow, celebrating the Soviet Union's victory and the Allied victory in the Second World War, Putin, in meeting after meeting, was telling the visiting delegations that it was his intention to invite the Ukrainians to resume direct negotiations. Now, in the West, we flatter ourselves. We assume that we are the main interlocutors that the Russians have in this conflict, apart obviously from the Ukrainians themselves. We are the people that Putin and the Russians speak towards or couch every statement for. Most people in the West, I expect, who think about this conflict, assume that Putin made his proposal on Saturday, mostly in order to win over or win the good wishes of US President Trump. I doubt, actually, that this is the case. For the Russians, as they've discovered over the last 3 years, it is world opinion outside what they still call the collective West that matters most. They want to make it clear to China, to their Brazilian and African and Asian and other friends, that it is the Russians always who are being reasonable in this conflict. They've seen all this rhetoric coming from the United States about the importance of a ceasefire and a negotiation. So they were anxious to counter it by announcing that they were prepared to enter immediately into direct negotiations with Ukraine, taking Istanbul 1, the agreement reached in April 2022, as the starting point. So that, I think, is what the Russians were doing. And that explains why Putin was apparently telling every delegation that came to Moscow for the Victory Day parade that this was his intention, to announce this proposal for negotiations to resume in Istanbul as soon as the Victory Day celebrations were out of the way. The European ultimatum perhaps changed some of the rhetoric that the Russians used when they announced their proposal, when Putin announced their proposal. But it did not change the substance of what the Russians had already decided. Now, unusually, there's a good article, or at least a fairly good article, not a very good article, about all of this in the London Times, and it's by Mark Bennett. Its words are, Putin's words change, but not his demand that Ukraine surrenders. Mark Bennett, incidentally, is a British journalist who used to work for the Russian news agency Novosti. And though he was never really a comfortable fit at Novosti, I suspect he has a better understanding of Russian thinking than most British journalists do. But anyway, he goes on to say the Russian president offers talks with Kiev, but translation from Kremlinese suggests he will accept no less than Zelensky's capitulation and swathes of territory. And it says that Putin's remarks were in essence very familiar. Although he proposed direct talks with Ukraine, Putin ruled out an immediate ceasefire and repeated the Kremlin's insistence that any negotiations should address the root causes of the war. In translation from Kremlinese to English, this is a reference, at the very least, to the removal of President Zelensky's pro-Western government in Kiev and a legally binding agreement from NATO that Ukraine will never be allowed to join. About the second, there is no doubt whatsoever. And it is also likely to be a reference to Russia's long-standing demand that Ukraine should surrender Crimea, as well as 4 regions in its east and south, including major cities such as Kherson and Zaporozhye. And he then quotes, Mark Bennett quotes comments by Peskov, which appear to support that. And then Mark Bennett comes to how the Russians feel about the threats, the new threats of sanctions coming from Europe. Threats by European leaders to impose massive new sanctions on Russia if it refuses to silence its guns will have been greeted with little more than a shrug by the Kremlin. Russia is already the world's most sanctioned country, and despite frequent predictions of economic collapse, there are few signs that living standards in Moscow and St. Petersburg have fallen significantly enough to force Putin to call off a war that he sees as his historical mission. I would, by the way, challenge that. So far, there's been no real sign that the sanctions have caused any sustained decline in Russian living standards at all. If anything, the contrary is true. Certainly over the last 2 years, 2023, 2024, living standards have actually risen. And then Mark Bennett continues, and so the Kremlin repeats its demands week after week, couched occasionally in different language, but with no fundamental change to its insistence that the only way to peace is for Ukraine to give Russia everything it wants. The film Groundhog Day, in which the actor Bill Murray is forced to relive the same day over and over again, is immensely popular in Russia. I didn't know that, by the way. I wonder whether that's even true. Judging by his comments on Sunday, Putin also appears to be a fan. Welcome to the Kremlin's time loop. Well, I think we can agree with the substance here, and it's good that at least one British journalist gets it. But of course, the language is completely wrong. Ultimately, the Russians are winning the war, and if this is indeed a war that they consider to be existential for themselves, and they are winning the war, and they do believe that the conflict is existential for themselves, then we should not be surprised if the Russians insist that any peace agreement must satisfy their demands and what they would say is their legitimate concerns. As I have said in program after program, and it's strange how difficult it is for people in the West to come to terms with this. The outcome of wars is determined by the winner, not the loser. It is unreasonable, or it's not unreasonable, it is unrealistic for losers to believe that they can dictate the terms of the peace. And people who come along and say angrily that the Russians must accept a ceasefire because if they don't accept a ceasefire, that means that they're not genuinely interested in peace. I mean, what they are in effect saying is that the Russians should forego the victory that they believe that they have won in order to prove their commitment to peace, which no one in the West is going to give them any credit for. After all, we now have not just threats, but actual proposals to set up war crimes tribunals to try Russian officials. That is not realistic either. Anyway, there it is. That's where we are in this conflict. Meanwhile, the war goes on. There were more drone and missile attacks by each side upon the other. And there's been, by the way, further news of more Russian advances over the last 24 hours. There are reports, for example, that the Russians are about to take control of the strategically important and heavily defended village of Bogatyr in southwest Donbass. This is the last remaining fortified position that the Ukrainians had created west of Kurakovo and the Andreevka fortified area. If Bogatyr falls, the way is open to advance into Dnipro region and to perhaps ultimately the Dnieper itself. And there's also been reports that the Russians have captured another village somewhat to the north, a village called Kotlerovka. We're told that military structures, strange expression, Russian military structures have told TASS that Kotlerovka is in fact neighbors on the Dnipro region to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Its liberation paves the way to the neighboring region, in other words, to Dnipro region as well. If you look at a map, both of these places, Bogatyr and Kotlerovka, lie well to the west, southwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians have in effect outflanked Pokrovsk from the west. If they do press further west from Katlerovka specifically and move on to the next big fortified village, which is, I believe, Novopavlivka, which is an important logistics hub, then Ukrainian defenses in this area and in the area of Pokrovsk will become increasingly weakened. And, well, there were reports again yesterday, not just reports, but further film confirmation of the presence of Russian troops in the village of Zvirove, which lies directly to the southwest of Pokrovsk. It's practically an outlying suburb of Pokrovsk. And as I discussed in an earlier program, that could mean that suggestions that the Russians have established some kind of foothold in southern Pokrovsk are actually true, and that fighting within Pokrovsk has already begun. But let me emphasize that I don't know this for a fact. This is purely an inference based on the fragmentary reports we're getting from a different parts of the battlefield. Anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if the noose around Pokrovsk is now steadily tightening, and things for the Ukrainians are getting harder and harder. I personally think that we will see the attack on Pokrovsk begin in earnest this month, and, well, we will see how long it lasts. Now, there's been lots of news of other Russian advances elsewhere along the battlefronts. I ought to say that in every part of the battlefront, every day now, we see Russian advances. There have been reports that fighting, for example, has resumed north of Kupiansk, that the Russians are now again taking territory north of Kupiansk in the bridgehead that they've established northwest, on the northwest banks of the Oskol River. And there are also reports that the Russians have resumed their advance in Zaporozhye region towards Orekhov, though I've heard nothing about the bridgeheads the Russians are supposed to have established on the west bank of the Dnieper River. Maybe those reports overstated the reality. Maybe those bridgeheads don't exist. But elsewhere, in Zaporozhye region itself, we are getting information about further Russian advances. But the most striking piece of news is what happened during the period of the Victory Day truce in Toretsk. It seems that the Ukrainians sought to take advantage of this unilateral truce that Putin had declared to again restart the Battle of Toretsk. Remember, a few weeks ago, shortly after the Russians announced that Toretsk had fallen entirely under the Russian control, the Ukrainians invited a group of journalists from the Daily Telegraph. They didn't go to Toretsk itself, but they visited places not far away, and they were told about an ongoing battle still underway in Toretsk. This, as I said, after the Russians had announced that they'd actually captured the town. And it was indeed the case that the Ukrainians carried out various counterattacks on Russian positions in Toretsk, and some of these counterattacks did occasionally succeed in capturing the odd building in one or two places, but the gains were ephemeral. The Russians, having captured Toretsk, were far too strongly entrenched in the town. They were quickly able to recapture all of these gains, these brief gains that the Ukrainians had made, and soon they were able to reassert full control of Toretsk all over again. Well, during the Victory Day ceasefire, the Ukrainians sent another large group of troops to try to restart the Battle of Toretsk all over again. And this can only have been another media operation. It cannot seriously have been the case that the Ukrainians generally believed that they would be able to recapture Toretsk from the Russians. But it does look as if they wanted to publish film during the Victory Day celebrations of their troops back in Toretsk, raising the Ukrainian flag, and one can almost see the headlines, Toretsk stands, and all of that. Well, the Russians apparently allowed the Ukrainians to advance deep into Toretsk. They then encircled them. A battle followed, and even Ukrainian reports are saying that the entire Ukrainian group that was sent into Toretsk, and I'm not going to try to guesstimate its number, but that the entire group was basically wiped out. I haven't read it, but I understand that even Deep State, the media operation, which as far as I can tell, is now heavily coordinating with Kirill Budanov's military intelligence, Ukrainian military intelligence, is reporting a variant of the story. This approach to conducting this war achieves nothing. It exacerbates Ukrainian casualties. Yesterday, I was reading about how the Ukrainians are looking to renew their attempt to break into Kursk region and to capture this village of Totlino, which they have been breaking their teeth on for at least the last week, probably longer. Again, this makes absolutely no sense. And in the meantime, of course, the Russians continue advancing. Now, even as all of this is going on, all sorts of other things have been taking place around the world. Now, the Americans and the Chinese have had their meeting in Switzerland. And the purpose of the meeting, which despite news media claims in the United States, this meeting, which was undoubtedly requested by the United States, has led to a quick reduction and a drastic reduction in tariffs by each side. Now, I understand that the Americans are reducing tariffs by 110%. So the tariffs were 145% and 115%, that they're reducing tariffs by 115%. So the tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States have now been reduced to 30%, which is still very high, but is not absurdly high, and is, by the way, less than the 54% Liberation Day tariffs that President Trump imposed on China in March. The Chinese have reciprocated by reducing their tariffs to 10% from 125%. So they've also reduced their tariffs by 115%, matching the American reduction. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is a retreat by the United States. We're told that this is only going to be for 90 days. There's going to be more detailed negotiations. Those negotiations will probably continue for months and probably years, because complex trade negotiations of this kind always do. I can't imagine that the United States seriously intends to impose these kind of tariffs on China, those kind of 145% tariffs on China all over again. If the United States were to try, based on what has happened, the Chinese will simply counter by raising their tariffs again, and the Americans will be back at square one. So I would regard this as basically a sort of win by China. Though I would also say that as far as I'm concerned, this is a return to reason and good sense. The tariffs imposed were impossible. They were preventing any trade from taking place at all. The whole idea of protecting American industries, had become subverted by a plan to launch an economic war against China. That seemed to me to be an incredibly bad idea, to put it mildly. And I can't really imagine that the United States really wants to do that. I suspect that even 30% tariffs is too high. It's going to have an inflationary effect. I would not be surprised if eventually these tariffs are reduced and we could find that tariffs on Chinese goods start to be pitched at the same 10% level as tariffs on goods exported to the United States by pretty much all other countries. Now, that, however, does bring us back to the topic of the Ukraine conflict, because we don't yet know what sanctions the United States and the European Union are planning. But if they are going to try to impose or threaten to impose secondary sanctions on countries that import energy, Russian energy, given that China is the biggest importer of Russian energy and looks like it's planning to step up its imports of Russian energy, are the Americans seriously going to tear up what they've just achieved in these negotiations in Switzerland by imposing secondary tariffs on China, which will result in trade between the United States and China coming to a complete stop again? Well, unless I am missing something, I cannot believe this. Putin and Xi have been meeting over the last couple of days. The Chinese media has covered Xi Jinping's visit to Russia in glowing terms. It doesn't seem to me as if the Chinese are at all interested in scaling down their economic relationship with Russia. The Russians have just announced today that they welcome the establishment of Chinese car factories on their territory. I suspect the economic relationship to develop. Putin spoke about Power of Siberia 2 being launched in 2027. I presume he means construction will begin then. So, secondary tariffs, further sanctions, secondary sanctions, all of that kind of thing on the Russians, exactly as Mark Bennett said, is going to be another exercise in punching air. What it will probably do is create more complications and disruptions in the world trading system, leading to a higher inflation in the West, hitting Western consumers. But it seems that now that they're so far up the sanctions escalator where Russia is concerned, the Europeans and the Americans have no real way of getting off. Anyway, that's what I think about that. I'm going to finish by saying two things. Firstly, as I said, there's not going to be a ceasefire. There's not going to be negotiations on Thursday. I think the net effect of what has happened is that it's exposed over the last couple of days, is that it exposed Trump's own doubts about the course his administration is taking, though it doesn't look as if he's prepared to act on those doubts, and it has probably bolstered the Russian position with their various BRICS and Global South friends. But quite plausibly, this attempt by the Trump administration to get some kind of negotiating process underway, some kind of peace process over the conflict underway, which was probably the last serious possibility of achieving a negotiated peace, and its failure. And I think we are almost now at the point where we can talk about its failure. Almost certainly means that we will get a military outcome, which is a decisive Russian victory. The Europeans, who have acted so hard to obstruct American moves towards a negotiated solution of the conflict, will probably at some point, will almost certainly at some point, come to bitterly rue and regret what they have done. Their ability to close their eyes to their own role is practically infinite, and knowing them, they will probably blame everybody but themselves. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, wrapping up. The second is I do want to say a little bit about the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. Now, it's very difficult to understand what exactly has happened, but the Indian media, which is now very active and has established a global reach, suggests that opinion in India is not at all happy with the ceasefire. The official line, so far as I can make it out, is that India launched a proportionate response to the terrorist incident in Kashmir, which India is adamant Pakistan was responsible for. The Pakistanis, instead of acting proportionately, then launched a massive attack on Indian positions, and that led to a massive Indian counterattack which caused significant damage to Pakistani positions. And then supposedly this caused panic in Pakistan. The Pakistanis then begged the Trump administration to intervene. The Trump administration, Vance and Rubio, contacted the Indians. There was a call eventually with Prime Minister Modi himself, but also more importantly with Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister. And the Indians said that they would be prepared to de-escalate and to agree to a ceasefire, provided the request came directly from Pakistan itself. And the Pakistanis delayed, allegedly, for 2 hours, but then they did eventually ask for the ceasefire, and at that point, India agreed. That all may be true. What I would say is that I get the sense of considerable anger in India over the way this whole affair has gone. There doesn't seem to be much gratitude for any role that the United States might have played. There seems to be, on the contrary, a feeling that the United States rushed to Pakistan's rescue when Pakistan was on the ropes. Now, that may be completely untrue, by the way. I have no way of judging. But anyway, that seems to be the popular sentiment in India. If anything, I would say that relations between India and the United States have been damaged by this episode. And I noticed with interest that the Indian Foreign Secretary, who is in a subordinate position to the Foreign Minister, anyway, the Indian Foreign Secretary, when he announced the ceasefire, did so without mentioning the role of the United States in it at all, suggesting strongly American displeasure. I understand that there's also been some comment in India about the fact that Prime Minister Modi himself has so far made no public comment about what happened. Anyway, that is the Indian view. The Pakistanis obviously take a completely different view. They don't accept the situation that they were on the ropes or anything like that. And there is an American view as well, and it was set out in CNN, which is that the Americans initially had decided that they would not intervene in the conflict, and then suddenly they received alarming intelligence. CNN is careful not to tell us what that alarming intelligence was, but anyway, they received alarming intelligence, and that made them work the phones to try to get the Indians and the Pakistanis to agree a ceasefire, which was ultimately successful. Now, in some respects, if you take a step back and think about it, the Indian account and the American account are not really in conflict with each other. Was the intelligence that caused the United States to intervene and to try to broker a ceasefire? Urgent request by Pakistan for American intervention because Pakistan was buckling under the pressure. Maybe the Pakistanis, if that was the case, made threats which the Americans felt they couldn't ignore. And of course, given that we're talking about nuclear powers, we can all guess what those threats might have been. But all of this remains deeply speculative, and I don't want to explore this based on the very limited information that I have. Suffice to say that the mood in India seems angry and unsatisfied with what has happened, and that some of that anger, as far as I can judge, appears to be directed at the United States. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.